G'day, it's Jamie, and welcome to Where's My Yowie. Today, I'm reading a fictional Yowie story written by Henry Lawson in 1903, so we'll get into it. This was published in the Clarence and Richmond Examiner on Tuesday, the 29th of December, 1903, titled The Hairy Man by Henry Lawson. As far back as I can remember, there has been in the Blue Mountains district of New South Wales the yarn of the Yahoo or Hairy Man. It scared children coming home by the bush tracks from school and boys out late after lost cows or kangaroos, and even grown bushmen going home along a lonely track after sunset would hold their backs hollow and whistle a tune when they suddenly heard a noise, say, the thud, thud of a kangaroo leaping off through the scrub, and thought of the hairy man. The hairy man was permanent, and his country spread from the eastern slopes of the Great Dividing Range right out to the ends of the Western Spur. He had been heard of and seen and described so often and by so many reliable liars that most people agreed that it must be something. The most popular and enduring theory was that it was a gorilla or an orangutan which had escaped as a youngster from a travelling menagerie long ago. It was also said to be a new kind of kangaroo of the last species of Australian animals which hadn't been discovered and classified. Dave Regan, Jim Bentley and Andy Page, bushmates, had taken a contract to clear and fence the ground for a new cemetery about 3 miles out of the thriving township of Mudgee Budgee. Dave and his mates camped in an old deserted slab and bark hut, which they happened to stand on the ground. It was a lonely place, in dark stringy bark bush, the nearest house being the hut of a timber getter and his family, about 2 miles along the track on the Home Rule side. It was the day after Anniversary Day, the anniversary of the founding of the colony, and Dave and Jim were patriots. Dave and Jim were feeling very repentant and shaky. They had spent the day at the Buckaroo races, half the night in Buckaroo and the other half in Home Rule, where the early closing law as regarded public houses was not so stringent. They had had a good time. They had betted and shouted away all their cash in hand, as well as an advance cheque drawn on the contract, had run up scores, the Lord knew how much at all the pubs, and had had several rows, and at least 3 fights. They weren't sure with whom, that was the trouble, but had a drink of lurid recollection of having got off their horses several times on the way home to fight each other. But the worst of it was that they had broken the bottle which they were bringing home last night for a morning reviver, and had nothing to straighten up on. Their nerves were not in a fit state to allow of their going to Mudgee Budgee at the risk of hearing some new and awful truths of last night's doings, and they hadn't had the courage to ask Andy to go. They were very contrite and gentle towards him, with their "Yes, Andy," and "No, Andy," and "No, thank you, Andy," when he fried chops and made coffee for them. The day before, they had both sworn to him solemnly, affectionately, and at last impatiently, and even angrily, and on the grave of all the faith they had broken with him, that they wouldn't get drunk, that they wouldn't bet, that they wouldn't draw a penny on the contract, that they'd buy a week's provisions first thing, and that they'd bring them things home with them on their horses, and that they'd come home early. And now They'd spent his money as well as their own. Andy made no remarks and asked no questions when they woke at midday, and they took his silence in a chastened spirit. Andy Page was a patriot and a Democrat too, the most earnest of the three, but he was obstinately teetotal, as he was honest and truthful. Dave was the head of the party, but Andy the father. Andy had on several occasions gone into town with Dave and Jim on pay nights to look after them, to fight them if necessary, and to get them home if possible when they'd had enough. But the last spree but one had disgusted Andy. He swore he'd never go into town with them again, and like most simple-minded, honest, good-natured fellows, whose ideas come slowly, who are slow at arriving at decisions, and whose decisions are invariably right, when he'd once made up his mind, nothing short of a severe shock of earthquake could move him. He'd stay at home on anniversary day, and washed and mended his clothes, and had read and tried to understand Henry George's Progress and Poverty. Dave and Jim were still moping wretchedly about the hut, when, towards the middle of the afternoon, an angel came along on horseback. It was Jack Jones from Mudgee Budgee, a drinking mate of theirs, bush telegraph joker, a ne'er-do-well of the district. He hung up his shy, spidery filly under a shed at the back of the hut. "I thought you chaps would be feeling shaky," he said, "and I've been feeling as lonely and dismal as an orphan bandicoot on a burnt ridge, so I thought I'd come out. I've brought a flask of whiskey." Never were two souls more grateful. Bushmate Chip is a grand thing, drunk or sober. Andy promptly took charge of the whiskey and proceeded to dole it out in judicious doses at decent intervals. Jack, who was of sandy complexion, young fellow, with the expression of a born humorous, had some news. "You know old Corny George?" They had heard of him. He was an old Cornishman who split shingles and palings in the Black Range, and hatted, that is, lived up alone in a hut in the dark gully under the shadow of Dead Man's Gap. "He went into Buckaroo to the police station yesterday," said Jack Jones, "in a very bad state. He swore he'd seen the hairy man." "The whatter?" "Yes, the hairy man. He swore that the hairy man came down to his hut the night before last, just about dark, and tried to break in. He said the hairy man stayed about the hut all night, trying to pull the slabs off the walls and get the bark off the roof, and didn't go away till daylight. Old Corny says he fired a gun at him 2 or 3 times through the cracks with his shotgun, but the hairy man didn't take any notice. The old chap was pretty shaky on it." "Drink, I suppose," grunted Dave contemptuously. "No, it wasn't the drink. They reckon he'd been having it too long. They've got him at the police station now." "What did he say the hairy man was like?" asked Jim Bentley. "Oh, the usual thing," said Jack. "About as tall as a man and twice as broad. Arms nearly as long as himself. Big wide mouth with grinning teeth and covered all over with red hair." "Why, that's just what my uncle said he was like," exclaimed Andy Page, suddenly taking great interest in the conversation. He was passing in with some firewood to stick under a pot in which he was boiling a piece of salt beef. Now he stood stock still and stared at Jim Bentley with a blank, breathless expression of a man who had just heard astounding news. "Did your uncle see the hairy man, Andy?" inquired Jack Jones feebly. He felt too sick to take much interest. "Yes," said Andy, staring at Jack with great earnestness. "Didn't I tell you? He was driving home up the pass to Dead Man's Gap, where he lived then, and he'd seen the hairy man bundling off amongst the rocks, Andy, and stared at Jack. "And what did your uncle do, Andy?" asked Jack with a jerky little cough. "He stood up in the cart and hammered into the horse and galloped it all the way home, full bat up to the door. Then he jumped down, leaving the cart and horse standing there, went in and lay down on the bed and wouldn't speak to anybody for 2 hours. "How long?" asked Jack feebly. 2 hours, said Andy earnestly, and went in with the firewood. Jack Jones proposed a bit of a stroll. He said it would do them good. He felt an irresistible inclination to giggle and wished to get out of hearing of Andy, whom he respected. Along the track, a bit there, was an incident which proved their state of nerves. A big brown snake whipped across the track and into a heap of dead boughs. They stared at each other for a full minute, then Jack summoned the courage to ask, "Did you chaps see the snake?" Then it was all right. They put a match to the boughs and stood round with long sticks till the snake came out. They went back to the hut and managed a cup of coffee. Presently they got on to ghost and hairy man yarns again. "That's the God's truth," said Jack. "That yarn I told you about what happened to me going up Dead Man's Gap. It was just as I told you. I was driving slowly up the little old spring cart of a mine when something, I don't know what it was, made me look behind, and there was a woman walking along behind the cart with her hands on the tailboard. It was just above the spot where the hawker's wife was murdered. She was dressed in black and had black hair, and her face was dead white. At first I thought it was some woman who wanted a lift, or a chat in woman's clothes, playing the ghost, so I pulled up. And when I looked around again, she was gone. I thought she'd crouched under the cart. I whipped up the horse and looked around again, but there was nothing there. Then I reckon I drove home as fast as Andy's uncle did. You needn't believe me unless you like." "Thunderstorm coming," said Dave, sniffing and looking around the corner to the east. "I thought this weather would bring something." "My oath," said Jim, "a regular old man storm too." The mighty blue-black bank of storm clouds rose boldly from the east and was overhead and sweeping down on the sunset in a very few minutes. The lightnings blazed out and swallowed daylight as well as darkness. But it was not a rainstorm. It was the biggest hailstorm ever experienced in the districts. Orchards and vineyards were stripped, and many were ruined round there. Some said there were stones as big as hen's eggs. Some said the storm lasted over an hour. Some said more. It was probably half or 3/4 of an hour. Hail lay feet deep in the old diggers' holes for a fortnight after. Inside the hut, the mates half expected the hail to come through the roof. Just as the storm began to hold up a little, they heard louder pattering outside and a bang at the door. The door was of hardwood boards with wide cracks. Andy rose to open it, but squinted through the crack first. He snatched the big crowbar from the corner, dug the foot of it into the earth floor, and jammed the pointed head under the cross piece of the door. He did the same with the smaller crowbar and looked around for more material for a barricade. "What are you doing? Who is it, Andy?" cried the others on their feet. "It's the hairy man," gasped Andy. They got to the door and squinted through the crack in turn. One squint was enough. They didn't have to push and crowd and say, "Let's have a look." It was the hairy man, right enough. It was about as tall as an ordinary man, but seemed twice as broad across the shoulders. It had long arms and was covered with hair, face and all. It had a big, ugly mouth and wild, bloodshot eyes. They helped Andy to barricade the door. There was another bang at the door. A cart rattled past. A woman screamed, and the cart went on at a great rate. There was a muzzle-loaded shotgun hanging on the wall, loaded. Andy had left it loaded the last time he'd been out kangaroo shooting to save ammunition. Andy, like most slow-thinking men, often did desperate things suddenly in a crisis. He snatched the gun down, stepped back a pace or two, aimed it at the door low down, and fired. He doesn't know why he aimed low down, except that it was too much like shooting a man. They heard a howl, and the thing, whatever it was, running off. They barricaded the door more. They scanned the door planking and found about half the charge had gone through. The powder must have got damp, said Andy. I'll put in a double charge to make sure, and he reloaded the gun with trembling hands. The other three bumped their heads over the whiskey. They can't say for certain how long they got through that night, or what they said or did. The first idea was to get out of there and run to Mudgy Budgy, but they were reluctant to leave their fort, who'd go out and reconnoitre. Besides, said Jack Jones, we're safer here, and the thing's gone whatever it is. What would they think of us if we went into town with a yarn about the hairy man? He had heard his horse breaking away and didn't care to look at risk of being chased on foot by the Yahoo. About an hour later, they heard the noise of a horse galloping past, and looking through the cracks, saw a boy riding towards Mudgy Budgy. It's young Foley, said Jack, the son of that old timber getter that's just taken up a selection on the road near Home Rule. I wonder what's up, said Andy. Perhaps the hairy man's been there. We ought to go along and help. They can take care of themselves, Jack said hurriedly. They're close to Home Rule and can get plenty of help. The boy wouldn't ride to Mudgy Budgy if there was anything wrong. The moon had risen full. Some 2 or 3 hours later, they saw Mahoney, the mounted constable, and the young doctor from Buckaroo ride past towards Home Rule. There's something up right enough, said Jim Bentley. Later on, they began to stare at each other less intently, and left off jumping when anybody spoke. About daybreak, Andy was sitting obstinately on guard, with the gun across his knees, and the others dozing on bunks and waking up now and then with jerks. When Constable Mahoney rode up to the door and knocked his business knock, it brought all of them to their feet. Andy asked him, very unnecessarily, to come in, and placed a stool for him, but he didn't see it. He looked around the hut. Whose fowling piece is that? He asked. It's mine, said Andy. Mahoney took the gun up and examined it. Is this fowling piece loaded? Yes, said Andy, it is. Now listen to me, boys, said the constable. Was this fowling piece discharged last night? Yes, said Andy, it was. What's up? What have we done? Asked Jim Bentley desperately. Done? Shouted Mahoney. Done? Why, you filled both old Foley, the timber getter's legs, with kangaroo shot. That's what you've done. Do you know what that is? No, said Jack Jones. He was thinking hard. It's manslaughter, roared Mahoney. What's the meaning of it? They explained the meaning as far as they were able. It seemed that Mahoney had further evidence. He had a weakness for the boys and a keen sense of humour outside himself. Best come along with me, he said. Andy had a stiff Sunday sack suit of chocolate colour and starched white shirt and collar, which he kept in a gin case. He always put them on when anything happened. On this occasion, he fastened his braces over his waistcoat and didn't notice until they got some distance along the road. There was great excitement at Foley's shanty, women and children crying and neighbours hanging round. Foley was lying on his face on a stretcher, and the young doctor examining and taking shot from the hairiest leg that Reagan and Co. had ever seen on a man or beast. The doctor said afterwards that some of the shots had only flattened inside the outer skin, while others had a covering of hair twisted around them. When Foley was turned round to give his dispositions, as Mahoney called them, they saw that he had enough hair on his chest to stuff a set of buggy cushions. He had red whiskers all over his face, rusty red spiky hair all over his head, and a big mouth and bloodshot eyes. He was the hairiest and ugliest man in the district. His language was mostly unprintable, partly because of the excitement he was still labouring under, and partly because his peculiar shade of brogue. When Mahoney said stone, Foley would say torn, a brogue with a drawl which sounded ridiculous in an angry man. He drawled most over his oaths. It seems that he was splitting his best bit of fencing timber down, beyond the new cemetery, when the storm came on. He thought it would be the usual warm thunderstorm. It was too far to run home. He didn't want to get wet, so he took his clothes off and put them in a hollow log till the storm should be past. Then the lightning played around his tools, the crosscut saw, axe, wedges, etc., and he had to get away from there. He didn't bargain for them blanking hailstorms. It's a wonder I wasn't scalped and drilled full of balls, he thought, of the hut, and made for it. And they wouldn't let him in. He suddenly saw some woman coming round the bend in the road in a tilted cart, and saw no chance of getting away. There was a clearing round the hut, so he banged on the door again. I thought the women would stop. Why do you think that? Asked Mahoney. What would they stop for? How the hell was I to know? Curiosity, I suppose. They welted into their old horse, and I turned to look after them, when the murdering villains inside shot a gun at me. Me legs are full of balls. I got back to me clothes and dressed somehow. Someone will have to pay for it. I'll be laid up on me back for 6 weeks. The young doctor excused himself and went out for a few minutes. Mahoney winked at Reagan and party, a wink he could hear, and it comforted them mightily. When they went out, they saw the doctor hanging onto a sapling some distance from the hut. He swung with his back to the sapling and slid to the ground, his legs stretched out in front of him. He said he would be all right presently. The thing was fixed up, but the young doctor wanted badly to have the case brought into court. He said it would cheer up the district for ages, and add 10 years to the life of the oldest inhabitant. He offered to pay expenses, but Reagan and party couldn't see it. The end. That's a classic old story from Henry Lawson. I like that. And also, here's a tip for you. If you're going to shoot a Yowie, make sure it's not the hairiest and ugliest man in the county or district running around naked. Okay, that's it from me. I'll get back to this all next time. Bye.